I think for like the first story, and I'll try not to get into too many of the details because I can talk about this kind of stuff for hours. Um, but the first time I really was exposed to the death of like a really young person, it was a boy that was about 14 years old. He had had cancer when he was really little and he beat it, and then when he was 14 years old it came back, and it had basically metastasized, so it was all over his body, and it was stage 4, and they basically knew that he was going to die. The family knew he was going to die. He probably knew he was going to die. And so at this point I was a funeral assistant. I wasn't a funeral director. So I was just there basically to help on the funeral. And I pretty much knew what had happened. But I was a little bit taken aback because this, I think, was pretty much my first funeral for a young person. And it seemed like the immediate family was taking it pretty well, which probably was just because they knew that this was going to happen. They had been told that he was going to die because he had cancer. But I remember very clearly when we got out to the graveside, which is basically the outside part right before the burial. Especially with Catholic funerals, this was a Catholic funeral. They usually watch the whole thing. They watch the whole burial. But before they do that, they'll put sand on the casket and then sometimes like a flower. And at this time, we had everybody else go first, and then the immediate family went last. And keep in mind that the immediate family, I don't think I saw them cry this entire time. As soon as the mom got up there to put earth on the casket and to put a flower on the casket, she drops to her knees and she starts bawling, sobbing. She's basically screaming and crying. And a lot of people, I don't think, during the whole process of the whole time that they're at the funeral home, even through the services, most of the time I don't think that they realize that this person is actually gone. A lot of times I think that they are still in that denial phase. But it seems like a lot of times at these gravesides, at the burial portion, that's when it kind of kicks in for some reason. And so the mother did. She dropped to her knees and she's sobbing and crying, and you can kind of see that it finally set in that her son had passed away. And that was the first time where I almost cried at a funeral. Because, as a funeral director or as an assistant, you're not really supposed to cry. You're supposed to be strong for the family. But it took everything in me to keep those tears in my eyeballs, because it's like an unforgettable kind of experience. The sound of her crying, it's not something that most people will ever experience in their life, which is good. Hopefully you never have to experience that, because it is an awful, awful experience. I think for the next story, I'm going to lighten it up a little bit, because that one's really sad, because no one should ever have to lose a child. But the next story is about anger, because a lot of people don't realize that most people who are grieving will show it through anger. And so I've had a couple experiences where people have been angry with me and they've yelled at me, and it's literally nothing was my fault. I didn't do anything to them, but I did. I got screamed at because they're grieving. That's it. And as a funeral director, you really have to be able to separate that kind of, you can't take it personally. You can't take it as an attack on you personally as a funeral director, because give them about 15 minutes, they'll probably apologize. And that's what they did. I had a family who thought that they had had prearrangements, and they did, but it was a different funeral home. And they didn't want to go to that funeral home. And my manager had told me that we would not be able to honor the prearrangements because we would get paid like $500 for those prearrangements. And in case you don't know, most of the time for prearrangements we get paid like $10,000, not $500. So because of that, she told me that we couldn't take the prearrangements. And so I had to break this news to the family in the nicest way possible. And for about 10 minutes, they screamed at me because they didn't want to go to this other funeral home. They didn't want to accept what I had just told them. And they were very, very upset. And keep in mind, this guy was a lot older who had passed away. He was a great-grandpa. So, he was, I think, in like his 80s. They knew that he was going to pass away. But because they were grieving, because, it was this woman's husband, it was most of the people in that arrangement room, it was their father, they were still very upset. They were still grieving. And so I get yelled at for 10 minutes. My manager decides that we will take the prearrangement since they've made such a fuss. And then I had to go in the other room and cry because even though I'm a funeral director and I'm kind of taught to not take those kind of things personally, it's still hard to get yelled at for 10 minutes straight for something that I didn't do, especially. And so I basically had to go in the other room, cry, get the prearrangement ready, and go back into that room and help this family. And at the very end of everything, they were completely satisfied. They were glad that they were able to have their services with us because they like our funeral home. But I had to deal with their grief and their emotions being taken out on me. And a lot of people don't think that while anger isn't really appropriate in that way, it's still something that as a funeral director you have to be prepared to deal with. Because that is one of the ways that people will grieve, is by taking it out on other people. It's something pretty well known in the industry that death brings out the worst in people. So I think the last story, it's another sad story, sorry. When you're a funeral director, you have a lot of sad stories. But death does bring out the worst in other people. So it's a pretty complicated story, but to sum it up, we had she was in her younger 30s. She overdosed on heroin and fentanyl, which she had gotten addicted to because she had chronic pain. She had a pretty tragic younger life. She got in a car accident. A drunk driver had hit them. Her younger stepsister died in the accident, and she became permanently disabled from the accident. She grows up. She has a husband. She has 3 kids. But she overdoses because she was dealing with chronic pain, and opioids were the only way to get rid of that pain, really. And she dies. And she comes to me, and we get to see the worst people at their worst. So during the arrangement meeting, basically the meeting where we plan out the funeral, the husband and the biological father get into a fight. We have to call the police. And because the husband is the direct next of kin, we have to basically set him aside and be like, you have to decide everything. And we had to kick most of the family out of the room because They were all saying back and forth, we want burial, we want cremation. They couldn't even decide on that. And our compromise was to have a service, a full service with the body present, and then cremation afterwards so that the husband could actually take her home. Because apparently she had said she wanted cremation, and he wanted to honor that. Well, a little bit before the funeral, we find out that the biological dad had basically a restraining order against, the lady who died had a restraining order against her biological dad. But unfortunately, a restraining order like that, it's not good for after the person's passed away. So we couldn't really do anything about it. So, we didn't really have any issues after that fight until the actual day of the funeral service. The biological dad basically tried to take over the entire service. And you could tell that the family was angry. Because this guy had songs that he was playing from an iPad up in the front of the funeral home, so I couldn't really do anything. And he literally had outfit changes. He was taking his shirt off and putting on a different shirt. He had props. He had these no trespassing signs. Like I said, she had a restraining order against him. And he basically tried to do his own little sermon. And so about halfway through, I tried to cut his mic. And I barely succeed in cutting his mic. And he storms off, takes his shirt off, and storms out of the funeral home. It was crazy. And, of course, the family was upset, but they apologized to me at the very end. And when you're a funeral director, you don't really accept those kind of apologies because whenever somebody apologizes for their family member like that, I'm like, this funeral service wasn't for me. This was for you. He should be apologizing to you guys, is what should be happening. But, of course, I haven't even heard from this man. I don't think. He kind of just never came back to the funeral home after that. Good, because I don't want to call the police again. But it really, a lot of times, we have families with issues, and it does bring out, people will come out of the woodwork, and it'll bring out the worst of the worst, and especially family members that already had problems beforehand. Usually the best case scenario with these is we have a private service, which basically means we don't publicize the date or the time. But of course, the family wanted her friends and stuff to be able to show up for her. So it was just kind of a difficult situation. And I was a baby funeral director at the time. So, now I know that if there's any kind of family issues, to just ban an open mic. No memories can be shared unless it's this specific person is allowed to go up to the mic, and that's it. But definitely we have some crazy situations like that whenever there's family drama already.